With the discovery of the New World, European empires fought for control of the vast, mysterious continent on the other side of the Atlantic. Italy, Spain, France, and England in turn. But none of these superpowers planted the seed that would eventually grow into the United States of America. Instead, it would be small handfuls of persecuted migrants risking their lives in search of one thing: religious freedom. Perhaps no one group would leave a more lasting impact on the future nation than the people simply called the Pilgrims. They were poor. They were outcasts. They were enemies of the state for their refusal to submit to the Church of England. They had to borrow money for the voyage. Even their benefactors took advantage of them. They wanted to worship their God as they saw fit, without fear, harassment, intimidation, lawsuits, imprisonment, or death. But they persisted until they were able to create in the New World a haven for religious freedom.
But what the Pilgrims did in Plymouth is absolutely amazing. Not only did they start self-rule, they started free trade, capitalism, land ownership, all in 10 years with 51 people. So the shadow they cast was an amazing shadow.
Let's hear it for the Pilgrims and the Mayflower.
2020 marks the 400-year anniversary of the Pilgrims coming to this great land. Landed right here on these shores, and from then, obviously, we would say it's all history. But what a great history America's had because of the Pilgrim voyage here, 400 years ago.
In order to fully understand the Pilgrims and their story, we have to understand the religious controversies that engulfed England at that time. For example, around midnight on November 5th, 1605 in London, England, a justice of the peace named Sir Thomas Knivett was making the rounds in the Parliament building. He caught a fellow in the cellar of the building. That man was Guy Fawkes, who, it turns out, had planted 36 barrels loaded with gunpowder under the building. The next day, November 5th, was to be an opening of proceedings in the House of Lords, attended by a special visit of King James. One of the lords received an anonymous letter encouraging him not to attend that day. By torturing Guy Fawkes, the authorities learned of a plot by a small group of renegade Catholics organized by Robert Catesby. They had rented a cellar that extended under the House of Lords in the Parliament building, and the goal was to blow up Parliament with their 1,800 pounds of gunpowder in those barrels. Thus, they reasoned, they would kill the king and the members of the House of Lords and violently force England to revert to Catholicism. All the men involved in the plot, including Fawkes, were tried and convicted and executed in cruel manners.
Ultimately, I think that the church was not about violence, about violent overthrow. And the use of power to make people change their religious visions or to belong to a certain group, that doesn't last. And that is contrary, totally contrary to the message of Jesus.
Remember, remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Guy Fawkes, 'twas his intent to blow up the king and Parliament, 70 barrels of powder below to prove old England's overthrow. By God's mercy, he was catched with a dark lantern and a burning match.
To this day in England, each November 5th, to remember this act of sedition, Guy Fawkes is burned in effigy. Even this famous mask is in remembrance of Guy Fawkes. This attempted assassination of King James and the members of the House of Lords would have amazing repercussions for religious nonconformists in England. Not only Catholics, but also Puritans and their spiritual cousins, separatists. Of course, the Puritans and the separatists, as well as the average Catholic, were men and women of peace.
But James I was left really frightened, and so he began a crackdown on everyone who he viewed as a potential enemy, which included all the nonconformists, those who were not conforming to the Church of England. That included the Puritans and the Separatists.
The king demanded religious obedience and would persecute dissidents to achieve it. One congregation of Puritan separatists was determined to escape the king's clutches, only so they could worship in peace according to the dictates of conscience. We know them today as the Pilgrims.
Separatists, like the Pilgrims were called at this time in the nation of England, were considered illegal. And the reason was you had the state-supported church. So the civil government sanctions what church you are to attend and where your tithes, which are actually billed to you, so it's not a free choice of tithe, you will support the parish church and you will worship as they say you worship. And so to do this illegally meant you could be arrested. If you continued, you could be put to death. In fact, some of the friends of the Pilgrims were killed in the Tower of London.
For more than a century and a half, England was convulsed in religious controversy. It began in the early 1500s, in an age when Europe was experiencing religious change and sometimes violence in the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. At first, King Henry VIII decried the Reformation and was even called the defender of the faith by the Pope. But Henry wanted a son to succeed him, and his lawfully wedded wife, Catherine of Aragon, could not produce one for him, only a daughter, Mary. He divorced her and remarried, but then was excommunicated by the Pope. So Henry, in turn, broke the entire church in his domain away from the Roman Catholic Church and called it the Church of England, making himself the monarch, the head of that church, along with the Archbishop of Canterbury. He had a daughter, Elizabeth, and later, in yet another marriage, a son, Edward VI. All told, Henry had 6 mostly unfortunate wives, 2 of whom he divorced, 2 of whom he executed. But Henry also did something else quite significant. He authorized for the first time an official translation of the Bible into English. One day that would bear unexpected results. When Henry died, Edward took the throne at the age of 9, and England remained Protestant. Edward was a sickly child, and he died after ruling for 6.5 years. His half-sister Mary took the throne, and she was determined to return England to Roman Catholicism, even if that meant by force. She earned the nickname Bloody Mary because she had many Protestant leaders in England rounded up and martyred. But her reign was short-lived, and Elizabeth I took over and ruled for almost half a century. She decided on a middle way, that the Church of England would be Protestant in its theology and Catholic in its worship style, and ruled by bishops and the monarch. As many Englishmen discovered the Bible for the first time, they felt the need for the Church of England to reform its ways, to be more like what they found in the New Testament. The vast majority of these religious nonconformists chose to stay within the Church to work for its purity. They were derisively called Puritans. The name stuck. The Puritans were not the only dissenting Christians in the Church of England. There was also a very, very small group of religious nonconformists that thought that reform within the Church of England was hopeless.
The difference is that the Puritans were trying to purify the Church of England, which they thought was lax and heretical after the Elizabethan settlement, whereas the Pilgrims, who would share the Puritans' Calvinistic theology, thought there was no point in trying to purify it. What you need to do is separate from it and establish your own church.
One specific congregation of the Separatists are known today as the Pilgrims. Their name implies that this world is not their ultimate home. They are only passing through. After Elizabeth, King James I ruled England from 1603 to 1625. He was no friend of anybody who deviated from strict conformity to the Church of England, and that included the Pilgrims.
I will make them conform, or I will harry them out of the land, or do worse.
James's philosophy was, no bishop, no king. He could control his subjects religiously through the means of bishops. Ironically, King James is best known today for the beloved masterpiece that bears his name, the King James Bible, which was first published in 1611. James enrolled more than 50 of England's greatest scholars, from Oxford, Cambridge, and Westminster, to assemble this translation.
The only reason that King James even agreed to a new translation of the Bible was to dethrone the Geneva Bible of 1560, which was very popular with the Puritans and the Separatists.
The group we know today as the Pilgrims was a particular congregation of separatists that met in mid-England, called the East Midlands, in the sleepy village of Scrooby, which is in Nottinghamshire. Scrooby is about 150 miles north of London. These pilgrims began meeting around 1606 in the manor house owned by one of their leaders, Elder William Brewster. William Wrestling Brewster of Plymouth, Massachusetts, is the great-grandson by 9 generations of Elder William Brewster.
William Brewster was the elder of the church. He was one of the founders of the church.
William Brewster was a remarkable man. He really had a great setup in the East Midlands because he had inherited an important post and for the government, and he could have stayed there and enjoyed that, but instead he took his home and turned it into a house church. And he put his heart with the separatists, and he became an elder and a leader. And when it was time to go to America, it was William Brewster who would be the key leader in getting them from Holland back to England and over to America.
They began their congregation with a concept they found in the Bible, the covenant.
A covenant is a formalized, usually religious agreement between parties. It's a promise. That's another word, a way of putting it. God is the witness, and it is with God. The United States can be said to be the first and, to a large extent, most Judeo-Christian country in the history of the world. The Pilgrims founded America for all intents and purposes.
Their chief pastor was John Robinson, who was a graduate of Cambridge University and a great biblical scholar. The Pilgrims' services were secret and were illegal. Their children helped them by watching to make sure no authorities were coming to arrest them.
Open up in the name of the king! Open up, you heretic!
They had to do it in secret. They couldn't really publish when they were going to meet. And the teenagers, like William Bradford at the time, were part of the youth group, which were called spies. And they would be outside listening to what people were saying. So if they heard anybody say, hey, they're going to meet here tonight, they would possibly change the time or even the day.
The King of England is the supreme authority in matters of religion as well as matters of state.
They paid a high price for practicing their faith according to their conscience. Pilgrim leader William Bradford would later write about the whole Pilgrim story in his book of Plymouth Plantation.
It is well known unto the godly, how ever since the first breaking of the light of the gospel in our honourable nation of England, Satan hath raised, maintained, and continued wars and oppositions against the saints. William Bradford, the opening lines of Plymouth Plantation.
Well, Bradford, who came into the separatist movement as a teenager, was there for all the big events. He was there in England, he fled England, he went to Holland, from Holland he came to America. In America, eventually he became the governor, he became the preeminent leader of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Colony, and he also became the great chronicler, the one who really recorded their life and what their hearts and beliefs were.
After a few years of anxiety of secret worship, of double church attendance, both in the Church of England so they wouldn't get punished, and then in their own secret congregational meetings, they decided to leave their country. In Holland, they reasoned, at least they would be tolerated. Their first attempt to leave ended in disaster. The ship captain they hired betrayed them and stole their possessions. Many of them ended up in jail. Their second attempt was also disastrous. On May 12, 1608, at the port of Hull on the east coast of England, a group of about 80 of them, men, women, and children, were on board a coal boat called Francis. The 80 passengers were attempting to flee the only country they ever knew, England, in order to find sanctuary in Holland. But they did not have an official license to travel.
Well, the separatists wanted to leave England. And in a sense, James I would have been glad to get rid of them, but the problem was, if you were considered a nonconformist, if you weren't conforming to the rules of the Church of England and the hierarchy under the king, then you weren't allowed to leave the country. So they were really caught between the rock and the hard place.
The coal barge, or bark as it was called, was able to carry the passengers out to sea where they could be transferred to a Dutch ship. Suddenly, the king's armed soldiers came to arrest them. By this time,
the poor men already aboard were in great distress for their wives and children left thus to be captured and destitute of help, and for themselves too, without any clothes but what they had on their backs, and scarcely a penny about them, all their possessions being aboard the bark, now seized. What weeping and crying on every side. William Bradford.
The authorities kept the women and children they captured in jail for a long time, but it grew to be an embarrassment because their behavior was so remarkable and their attitude was so good. Well, the men made their way back and the women and children went home, but they tried again. They were not going to give up.
Eventually, they made it over to Holland and within a year settled in the town of Leiden. There they spent many good years.
Being thus settled, after many difficulties, they continued many years in a comfortable condition, enjoying much sweet and delightful society and spiritual comfort in the ways of God. William Bradford.
But after about a decade, they became restless. The hard work, the extra hours, the poor jobs, working in a second language, all of this took its toll. But the worst problem was that some of their children were enticed by the worldly Dutch youth and were leaving the church.
Another concern for the Pilgrims was that the treaty of peace between Spain and Holland was going to expire. What this could mean is that they would lose their religious toleration because Spain could reinvade Holland as it had earlier.
When the Pilgrims were in Holland for more than 12 years, they realized several things. Actually, the year 1617 was their year of decision. When that time, they realized the truce with Spain was going to end in 1620. Secondarily, they realized that they were getting older. Their children were not walking in their ways the way they wanted to. The temptations of a freer Dutch society were such that they didn't like that.
And so they began to consider another move, this time to the New World, to America.
It was no small decision to decide to go to America. America was this mysterious, dangerous place, a place of three-headed snakes, a place they had heard of unicorns, a place where there were saber-toothed tigers, where there were cannibals. Those were the stories that were coming back from the early explorers in America. And so it was a very fearful place, and it was a very difficult decision to decide that you're going to take your wife and your children and you're going to expose everyone to those kind of dangers in America. But the great desire to have this freedom of faith drove them to do that. And so when they finally made the decision where to go, they decided they would go to wilderness America.
They finally decided to settle in the northern parts of Virginia, which in those days meant near the mouth of the Hudson River. To finance such a venture, they found some sympathetic London businessmen willing to invest in the costly move.
When the Pilgrims decided they really were going to leave and they made that decision, they had to get adventurers, which were businessmen, to finance their voyage. And even though they would sell their homes and their goods, they couldn't come up with the amount of money necessary.
By this time, the Scrooby congregation, now living in Leiden, Holland, numbered about 400 to 500. And it was decided that only about 50 of them could go in the first major trip to the New World. They hoped to send out portions of their congregation piecemeal. One modern clergyman, D. James Kennedy, noted that, in that sense, America began as a church relocation project. The Pilgrims leased a small ship for the expedition, the Speedwell in Holland, to supplement the main vessel, the Mayflower, in England that they rented. The plan was for a group of pilgrims to leave Holland on the Speedwell and then to join up with others on the Mayflower on the coast of England. Before departing on the Speedwell, they held a prayer service on board.
There's a painting in the United States Capitol which depicts John Robinson opening the Geneva Bible. It's very clearly a Geneva Bible when you look at it in the painting, and having a worship service on board the Speedwell before they would leave Holland and go join with the Mayflower.
The Speedwell then sailed to England, where it was going to join the Mayflower for the two of them to go to America.
So when the Pilgrims decided to come here, they had to hire different individuals. First of all, they had to hire a barrel keeper, someone to keep the barrels. They had to make sure that that all their supplies were kept in good stead. That was John Alden. You also had individuals that were hired to help them in defense, like Miles Standish, who had been a soldier in the Low Countries, had come to understand who the Pilgrims were. So these people were not of their church. They were not necessarily converted saints, as one person would put it, and they came to be known as strangers. Now, they did not necessarily mean that they were not Christians, but they may have been a part of the Church of England. And they would carry King James Bibles. And you have the Pilgrims carrying Geneva Bibles right next to each other. And they recognized this because they were coming for one purpose, and yet it was the church purpose. Look, these other people would not have come on this voyage had not the Pilgrims wanted to plant a church here. So they were coming together.
One of the strangers they had on board was the man chosen by their financial backers, Christopher Martin, to be the leader of the Mayflower. But Martin had a very crude and abrasive personality. He could well be described as a prima donna without portfolio. Christopher Martin called himself the governor of the Mayflower.
Not all of the Pilgrims were these non-confrontational people who were easy to be around with, and Martin was one of them.
He so insulteth over our poor people, with such scorn and contempt, as if they were not good enough to wipe his shoes. It would break your heart to see his dealings and the mourning of our people. They complained to me, and alas, I could do nothing for them. Robert Cushman.
The voyage of the Mayflower was unique in that families were coming together to travel overseas. This was rare for the early 1600s. They left in July with plenty of time to arrive safely, but 2 times the Speedwell proved unseaworthy.
If she had stayed at sea but 3 or 4 hours more, she would have sunk right down. Robert Cushman.
One of the passengers of the Speedwell, who chose to remain in England for the present, was Robert Cushman, a man who was instrumental in arranging things between the Pilgrims in Holland and their financial backers in England. Sadly, the stress of all the arrangements, and especially the 2-month delay caused while trying to fix the Speedwell, affected Robert Cushman.
An infirmity of body hath seized me, which will not in all likelihood leave me till death. What to call it I know not, but it is a bundle of lead, as it were, crushing my heart more and more these 14 days, as although I do the actions of a living man, yet I am but as dead, but the will of God be done. Robert Cushman.
Cushman even noted that if the Pilgrims ever make it to the New World and did finally create a colony, it will only be by the miraculous hand of God. They finally decided to forget the Speedwell. Some of the passengers from that ship crammed into the already crowded Mayflower. Those unable to go that first trip planned to sail to America another day.
They had 2 boats, and one of them sprung a leak. So they were families that mothers and fathers would say, take my children to the New World. And there were wives who said, I will stay behind, or I have to stay behind. There were families that were split up. So there were a lot of children who were given to other people to either stay in England or come over. There were families that were ripped apart. Half of them went, half of them didn't.
The 2-month delay meant that their food rations were down and, worst of all, they were about to set sail during the stormy season. Finally, the Mayflower alone set sail from Plymouth, England on September 6, 1620. This was already becoming a dangerous time to leave because of the approaching winter and hurricane season.
After they had enjoyed fair winds and weather for a season, they were encountered many times with crosswinds and met with fierce storms with which the ship was wickedly shaken. William Bradford.
It was an exceedingly difficult trip. For 2 months, 102 people were wedged into what they called the 'tween decks, the cargo space on this boat. They had about 5.5 feet of headroom. No one was allowed above decks. All the hatches were battened down because of the terrible storms.
Bow down thine ear, Jehovah, answer me.
One of the things the Pilgrims did to comfort themselves and remind themselves of God's care was to sing the Psalms. Yet this gained them the ire of some of the crew members. One in particular sneered that he looked forward to throwing half of their dead bodies overboard.
He would always be condemning them and cursing them daily with his grievous execrations. But it pleased God, before they came half seas over, to smite this young man with a grievous disease, of which he died, and so was himself the first that was thrown overboard. William Bradford.
This profane crew member was one of only 2 casualties of the whole voyage, the other being a young man who died. Only 2 deaths on a voyage like that was extremely unusual for those days. During the voyage, a young man named John Howland could easily have perished. In a storm, he was swept out to sea, but he grabbed a rope and was pulled to safety. John Howland would go on to live a long life in America, and he even became the ancestor of 3 U.S. presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush. Amidst a terrible storm, the main beam of the mast cracked. Death was certain for the crew and passengers if this couldn't be repaired. The whole Pilgrim story could easily have ended up on the bottom of the Atlantic. But one of the Pilgrims had a large iron screw on board. Some historians argue it was a jack for lifting roofs onto houses. Others argue it was part of a printing press. Whatever it was, the main beam was secured with this large screw, and so the Mayflower was saved. On November 9, 1620, 66 days after their departure, they first sighted land off Cape Cod.
Being thus arrived in a good harbour and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth. William Bradford.
Since they were sailing to the northern parts of Virginia, they realized they had been blown off course. It turns out they were some 250 miles off course. But their attempts to sail south were completely hindered by dangerous shoals along the coast. They interpreted this as the hand of God guiding them to stay there. So they stayed in Cape Cod and landed on the Provincetown tip. For the next several weeks, they would explore the coast of Cape Cod, looking for a place to settle down. However, they had to clear something up first before they set a foot on the new land. They had to stifle a potential mutiny before it happened.
When the Mayflower Compact was written, November 11, 1620, on board the Mayflower itself, it was written in order to stop a mutiny, a potential mutiny, where some of the ones who were not part of the church said, hey, we'll do what we want to do.
Thus, before disembarking, the Pilgrims ended up making world history by writing up what Winston Churchill called one of the remarkable documents in history. It was a key forerunner to the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. It was the Mayflower Compact.
In the name of God, Amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord, King James, having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and the honour of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. Do by these present, solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one of another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid. The Mayflower Compact.
They do something unique. They create their own government. They call it the Mayflower Compact. We, in the presence of God, covenant ourselves together to form a civil body politic, to enact just and equal laws as shall be thought most meet or necessary, unto which we promise all due submission. Simple, revolutionary. It was a polarity change in world government. Instead of top-down, ruled by these kings that keep getting more and more powerful, it's bottom-up. It's the people themselves deciding what laws they're going to pass and agreeing to submit to them. It was a polarity change in world government.
And yet the Mayflower Compact, when it was written, it deals with both converted and unconverted. It deals with believers and unbelievers as equals before the law. This is way ahead of their time. This is where John Robinson taught them to be tolerant toward other people, to be respectful of other people, even if you disagree. And this laid a very important seed in America.
In the cabin of the Mayflower, humanity recovered its rights and instituted government on the basis of equal laws, enacted by all the people for the general good. George Bancroft.
They put the building blocks down for the writing of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Those building blocks came from the Pilgrims, who built a civil government on biblical law. The only way you can build a civil government.
I believe the Bible played a huge role in the founding of our country. One of the things we do in teaching our children, especially the curriculum that we recommend to families, you look at it from a point of integrating everything, from the Pilgrims to the Puritans, from Frederick Douglass to Susan King Taylor to Booker T. Washington, to all of these people who have made this country the great country that it is.
To the Pilgrims, the Mayflower Compact was nothing new. It embodied the democratic principles the Pilgrim congregation had been practicing all along since they had secretly formed a congregation many years ago. Before they had even left the Old World, their pastor, John Robinson, had written them a letter for guidance upon arriving in the New World.
Lastly, whereas you are to become a body politic, using amongst yourselves civil government, and are not furnished with any persons of special eminence above the rest, to be chosen by you into office of government. John Robinson.
John Robinson is probably the most important pilgrim who never came to America, in the sense that he was the pilgrim pastor, and he had this great heart for the Lord, and he had this great heart to be able to worship in a way they thought was biblical. And opportunity came after a lot of prayer, after solemn assemblies, and a decision to go to America. And it was Robinson who was really behind it. And the great irony is, he didn't get to go.
Pastor John Robinson had every intention to come to America, but he died in 1625 before he had the opportunity. The Mayflower Compact was based on democratic principles he had taught them so well.
The Pilgrims themselves, when they set up their own church government, set it up so that the people would vote for the pastor. They would actually vote in the pastor. The cornerstone of what the Pilgrims believed and why they elected their own pastors and would eventually extend that to electing their own civil magistrates was their idea that self-government was so important.
Despite the effectiveness of the Mayflower Compact to bind the fledgling colony together, it was never officially recognized back home, nor would later such charters of the Puritans.
In England, other than the time of Oliver Cromwell, the English kings were always trying to revoke the charters of Massachusetts. They were trying to revoke every patent that they had given, especially since 1629, when the true patent that overshadowed the Pilgrims came, written by John White, because it was too much self-government.
The Mayflower Compact was signed November 11, 1620. For the next several weeks, small exploring parties of the Pilgrims would set out ashore to discover the lay of the land. They even found a hidden mound of several ears of corn stored by some Indians. That corn saved their lives.
So they come to land, they find this cache. Now, it's 1620, They are the most faithful individuals that you can ever realize. And when they found this cache of corn, they said, praise God. God provided this for us.
When they landed on the tip of Cape Cod, they had run out of food. The men looked around the Cape, found a stash of corn buried in the ground by the Indians, and they took it. They did not steal the corn, they borrowed it, they paid it back later.
And in Bradford's diary, when they started meeting with the Native Americans, Bradford said to the envoy going, find out whose corn that was so we can repay it.
Had they not taken it, they never would have survived. Because you see, by the end of the first winter, they were doling out a 1/4 pound of cornbread per person per day to survive on. So as you can well imagine, the mothers took their bread and fed their children. They covered their children with their own bodies to keep them warm. Of those 18 married women, 14 died the first winter, sacrificing themselves for the next generation, knowing if they did not survive, we would not survive.
As the Pilgrims continued to explore the shoreline of Cape Cod, on December 11th, they came across Plymouth for the first time. It proved to be the ideal place to make their new home.
Let's get the scene. Wrong place, wrong time. They're all sick. They have come to land in Plymouth. They've decided this is the place because of Town Brook. They were looking for water. In Bradford's diary, it says, we're very much without ale. We have to land. Because they had ale, because ale would be much more potable than water.
They drunk our first New England water with as much delight as ever we drunk drink in all our lives. William Bradford.
During that first winter of 1620 to 1621, they had to stay aboard the ship. It was too difficult to build houses and buildings in the freezing, howling wilderness. That winter proved to be a season of death for the Pilgrims. Just about every day, 3 or 4 of them died. Most of these died aboard the Mayflower or the common lodge they had managed to build in Plymouth. Among the dead were Christopher Martin, the so-called governor of the Mayflower, and John Carver, the man the Pilgrims elected to be their governor. After that, the Pilgrims chose, year after year, for about 30 years, William Bradford to be their leader. They buried them in the mound across from the Mayflower, not knowing if the Indians were watching them or they might attack them.
They didn't know about the Native Americans, so when they first got here, they buried their dead in private, in unmarked graves.
Some of the crew members who were dying of contagious diseases were abandoned by their former drinking buddies. Only the Pilgrims helped them. In some cases, this touched the hard hearts of some of the crew. "Oh," one of them cried to the Pilgrims, "you, I now see, show your love like Christians indeed one to another, but we let one another lie and die like dogs."
Only 4 families remained intact after that brutal winter of 1620 to 1621. The Pilgrims were to find out, after settling in Plymouth, that in that area, most of the Indians had actually been wiped out in a plague that took place 3 years before the voyage of the Mayflower.
In the end, Plymouth and Cape Cod proved to be one of the safest places the Pilgrims possibly could have come to set up their peaceful haven for religious liberty. One of the earliest challenges the Pilgrims faced was a demographic one. That first winter had killed so many of them that they had to marry and reproduce their way back to a greater population. When the ice cleared up, Captain Jones knew he could now sail the Mayflower back to England. Before he left, he gave an invitation to any of them all, saints or strangers, to return home to England, to give it up. After all, half of their number had died that first winter. But no Pilgrim took him up on his offer.
And for me, one of the most defining moments of their faith came in the spring when Jones turned to them. Half their number have died. This is not what they signed up for at all. And Jones says, anybody who wants to come back to England with me, I will take them. Not one of them went.
When the Mayflower returned to England, some of the London investors were critical of the Pilgrims for not having it laden with goods from the New World. But the Pilgrims had been working hard just to survive the brutal winter and had no practical means to supply the ship with beaver skins or clapboard or any other goods. Elder William Brewster was the de facto pastor of the Plymouth colony.
William Brewster was a man who was the ruling elder of the Pilgrims, and he fulfilled the pastoral role when they were here, though he would not function in delivering the sacraments because he believed that an ordained pastor should be the one to do that, and they didn't have an ordained pastor for 9 years. Think of it, a church without an ordained pastor for 9 years. That's a pretty self-governing church. And William Brewster was not the only one who would preach on Sundays, so they would have a church government that was, of course, by consent of the governed.
You know, he was the major religious leader and I always say that he should have written a book, because everybody talks about Bradford because he wrote a book, and Brewster didn't write a book.
The church was the central focus of the Pilgrims' colony. The first building they built served as a church, as a meeting house like a town hall, and even housed some of them. They would often march to church with a drummer ahead of them, and with the men bearing muskets and swords for protection.
Love. Without the number one commandment, everything else makes no sense.
Sunday was an all-day affair. It was huge. You know, when you do they do the reenactment of the Pilgrim Progress. When they walk, they're walking to church.
The Psalms provided the main hymn book for the Pilgrims.
Bow down thine ear, Jehovah, answer me.
In fact, the whole Bible was the center of their colony and the core of its entire purpose.
The Pilgrims did live according to the Bible. That was their textbook for life. People come here and they say to me, this is wonderful, but these children, they couldn't have been well educated. There was no formal school, and there wasn't. But they were well educated. They learned at home, their parents taught them, and their textbook was the Bible. But they did have supplementary materials. Governor Bradford himself brought over 400 books with him on the Mayflower. The governor could speak 5 languages. As the winter of 1621 turned to spring, an Indian man walked into the fledgling new colony. His name was Samoset, who was a friendly man, declaring, "Hello, Englishmen." He came back soon with another Indian who would turn out to be critical for the Pilgrim survival. His name was Squanto.
And I call him the land bridge, the human bridge to Western civilization. He was a Native American who was taken to England, became a Christian, learned English, and when the Pilgrims came, he was the human bridge for the Pilgrims to interpret and translate to the natives the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Squanto continued with them and was their interpreter, and was a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectation. William Bradford.
Squanto taught them how to catch eel and how to grow corn.
See, the soil in Plymouth is so bad, so sandy, you can't grow anything in Plymouth. So that's what he would do. He'd build a mound of sand, put 4 fish in it, wait 2 weeks for it to decompose, plant corn. The corn grows, you plant beans. The beans use the corn stalk to grow. Then they would plant cabbage, low-lying plant, that held the nitrogen in the ground and kept out the weeds. That's called combination planting, the 3 sisters. And Squanto would show the Pilgrims how to do this and how to survive. So he was very instrumental in our survival.
So, and Squanto, of course, taught them also how to fish. So you take your shoes off, you go barefoot into Town Brook where the muck is there, and you stamp your feet, and when you feel something squirting there, you stamp very hard. The eel squirts up, and you catch it, and you fry it. What a delicious dinner.
Squanto also translated for them as they negotiated a long-lasting treaty of peace with the Indians, which was signed by their chief, Massasoit.
Bradford says Squanto was an amazing vessel sent by God to help them. They now have an interpreter, and of course eventually have that peace treaty only a few days later with Massasoit, who comes with several of the Indian chiefs, and they sit down. He's the chief, but they come with several warriors, and they sit down and they make that peace treaty right here in Plymouth.
If he didn't sign that peace treaty, the Pilgrims wouldn't have survived. And it lasted 55 years, but 3 years into that peace treaty, Massasoit was at his camp in Rhode Island. See, back then the Wampanoag lived right here in Plymouth and on Cape Cod and in New Bedford and in Rhode Island. He was chief of all of them. Now, he's at his camp in Rhode Island. The man had the plague. He was dying. A gentleman from Plymouth by the name of Edward Winslow put some herbs together, and Ed Winslow walked to Rhode Island to nurse Massasoit back to health. Winslow walked 40 miles. Halfway there, he was met on a path by an Indian who told him not to bother finishing the trip. Massasoit died. Well, he finished the trip anyway, and he discovered Massasoit had not yet died. He was very close, and Ed Winslow nursed him back to health. From that day forward, they were great friends, and that peace treaty was even stronger.
There's really three entities. There's the Pilgrims, there's the strangers, and there's the Native Americans. And they needed to learn how to get along and in a cohesive nature when they came here.
The Indians in that particular area had been very hostile to Europeans, yet most of them had died off in a plague that swept through there a few years before the Pilgrims came.
Yeah, had not the Pilgrims settled in Plymouth, a lot of the tribes here were very hostile, and they would have been in trouble. But also keep this in mind, the Pawtuxets were hostile. Had the Pawtuxet Indians survived that plague, they probably would have wiped the Pilgrims out.
The Pilgrims, who came in peace, came unto a territory that was not a barren wilderness with the need to clear all the land. There were already cultivated fields. Meanwhile, the Pilgrims, being dedicated to living out their faith, made sure that they paid a fair and just price for everything. That included the land. There was not 1 square inch of property they purchased that Chief Massasoit did not approve the land sale first.
See, the Indians didn't want the land. They wouldn't come back on it because of the plague. The Pilgrims took land nobody wanted. Everything after that they paid for to the Chief Massasoit. And this is very important, because if we cannot own property, we have absolutely no power.
We have right in Plymouth all the land deeds that have been recorded and that Indian chiefs gave their signature to. Do you know it's interesting that all the land here, William Bradford would not allow another colonist from the English to ever sign a land deed without the personal permission of Massasoit. Massasoit had to give his permission to make sure that they weren't being cheated.
In later eras, European settlers as well as Americans mistreated Native Americans in grave miscarriages of justice. But in doing so, they were not at all following the example of the Pilgrims.
The Pilgrims had good relationships with the Indians. The Pilgrims were kind to the Indians. They showed them love. They showed them compassion. They showed them the godly way to live.
The Pilgrims planted their crops and enjoyed the first harvest. They set aside time to thank God. They had survived in the new land.
The first Thanksgiving was in October of 1621. They planted their corn and they cleared land, but there was a great drought that came upon the land, and the Pilgrims called a day of fasting and prayer, called the Indians together with them to observe, and they fasted and prayed, and they called upon God to send rain to water the crops, otherwise they would all be without food throughout the winter that was coming. Rainfall came. They had the most abundant crop that the Indians had ever seen, and they celebrated the first Thanksgiving. For days they celebrated, but the Indians came, brought their deer, brought their waterfowl, brought their corn, and they sang and they played games and they preached and they practiced and they fellowshiped together.
I think Thanksgiving and some of the other national holidays, these are perfect examples of how faith can be experienced by so many people in different expressions, and yet it still unites us. While the Pilgrims were one religious tradition, the separatists from England and Europe could come to this country, others could embrace that same spirit of gratitude. And gratitude is universal.
The Pilgrims had an exemplary relationship with the Indians for decades. When an Indian had been murdered by 3 Englishmen, and those Englishmen were put on trial, the Indians expected merely a charade, a show trial. In short, they expected a miscarriage of justice.
In 1630, 3 Europeans killed an Indian on the Rhode Island border. 2 of them were captured and brought back to Plymouth for a trial. One of the 3 judges that sat in on that trial, a man named John Jenny, he built the grist mill. Naturally, the Indians thought it would be a joke. A mock trial, go through the motions, get it over with, let them go. After all they did was kill an Indian. John Jenny found the 2 men guilty and had them hung. Everybody was equal under the law. Now the Indians could trust the Pilgrims. They were people of character and integrity who stood by their word.
Amazingly, another Englishman convicted and hanged for murdering an Indian had been one of the passengers of the Mayflower, John Billington, a stranger. One of the stipulations of the London adventurers who had lent money to the Pilgrims for the expedition was that everyone in the colony was to receive exactly the same amount of money, the same amount of salary, no matter how much work he or she did. The problem with this imposition is that those who worked hard were paid just the same as those who chose not to work at all. This common store stipulation undercut productivity immensely.
So now the Pilgrims come over here, they're virtually in a socialistic situation, a communal living, where everybody at the plantation worked in the same field, grew their food, then at the end of the season they simply evenly split with each other what they produced.
The Pilgrims did experiment with this socialism or communalism, and they realized it didn't work. It is against human nature. The moment you tell people that the community will take care of you, they work less. It undermines character.
1623, Governor Bradford changed the deal. We're going to stop a communal existence. We're going to go to land ownership. Every family will own their own land, grow their own food, and feed themselves. Then we'll trade with each other what we have left over. Free trade. That worked. They never had a starving day after that. They tripled their production. Of course, it did leave them with one little problem. How do you divide the land? Our Pilgrims divided their land equal to the amount of people in their family. More kids you had, more land you would own. See, we had a little problem, a little population. We had 51 people. We had to get moving. Believe me, it worked. Did you know that today 10% of the population of the United States are Mayflower descendants? 30 million people from 51. Shows you what an incentive will do. Works every time. In no colony in the country will you see two statues of women other than Plymouth, because we honored our women.
The Pilgrim mothers deserve far more credit than the Pilgrim fathers, in that they had to put up not only with all that the Pilgrim fathers did, but with the Pilgrim fathers themselves. The Dominion Illustrated Monthly.
If a child were to say, well, do I have to go to church? Imagine asking someone who has gone through what they've gone through, do I have to go to church? I think that the father would have said, you have no idea what I did and what our congregation did to get here so that you can go to church.
The Pilgrims diligently worked to pay back the loans that had allowed them to sail to America. Tragically, in a day before insurance, one of their ships laden with beaver skins and other goods to pay back their creditors was captured on its way to England. It was a total loss for the Pilgrims, but later they were able to completely pay back everything they owed. Eventually, other ships from Holland came as more of the congregation joined their separated brethren in the New World.
After the Pilgrims got settled in Plymouth, they were able to advertise and send word back to England saying to all the nonconformists, come to New England, you can worship here freely.
Plymouth led to Boston and led to Providence and led to Hartford and the surrounding communities. 400 years have come and gone since, and Plymouth likes to call itself America's hometown, and with good reason.
Hello, America's hometown!
What we do here in Plymouth, Mass. is really retell the story, the great story of America. And obviously we tell the whole Pilgrim story, why they came, why they fought to be here, and the outcome of their incredible sacrifice and faith to be here, and how it's totally transformed in this nation. Not only this nation, it's transformed the world because of their, what they did at the very beginning. Even the Mayflower Compact and on. The Pilgrim was really the founding of this great nation. So we're proud to be able to display that this morning and to share that with the rest of the world.
The Mayflower was a cargo ship, but the most precious cargo that was carried across the Atlantic were the ideas in the hearts of the Pilgrims that were drawn from the Bible. You see the seeds of liberty, both religious liberty and civil liberty, and the idea of self-government and rule from within. All these are within that body of Pilgrims.
Commercially, Plymouth was never a resounding success. Winston Churchill noted, "The financial supports in London reaped no profits." In 1627 they sold out, and the Plymouth colony was left to its own resources. Such was the founding of New England. It may have technically been a commercial bust, but in so many other ways, Plymouth was a major outpost. The original stalwart souls who created a colony in the howling New England winter just so they could worship according to the dictates of conscience had far more influence on world history than they could have ever imagined.
They epitomize much of what was ideally the American view of law and government. They recognize that there is a higher law, the law of God, and that God presides over the affairs of nations.
It's amazing to me that you had pilgrims who came to this nation. And those pilgrims had a love for the Lord, and they brought that here, and that's part of the fabric. It's amazing to me that when the Pilgrims came, there was already a whole community called Native Americans who have contributed so much and still do to the beauty of this nation. It's amazing that a group would come over with the darker hues of skin, and they'd come on slave ships. And yet we helped to build this nation. And yet when we all come together, if we do it right, and we've been practicing a long time, at least 400 years, if not longer, but here's another opportunity to get it right. And I actually believe we can.
Thus, out of small beginnings, greater things have been produced by his hand that made all things of nothing, and gave being to all things that are. And, as one small candle may light 1,000, so the light here kindled hath shone unto many, yea, in some sort to our whole nation. Let the glorious name of Jehovah have all the praise. William Bradford.